All right, so we've seen a couple of different CSS pseudo selectors. Now we're going to put them to use. We're going to build a simple but hopefully meaningful demo. It's going to be a button, just a single button, but it takes a couple of the pseudo classes and builds upon them. So here's what it looks like. It has sort of a 3D effect. And as I hover over this button, it does nothing, by the way. So it's purely visual. Clicking it doesn't do anything as far as functionality. But I hover, it looks like it depresses a bit, and then I click, and it depresses all the way. So there's three states. There's the intermediate, the hover state, and then there's the click, which is actually the active state, and then there's the base state. So the way that this will work, if you'd like to follow along, is I have a starter code pen that has nothing in it really, just the markup. So a font that I'm going to use, the H1 and the button. And then everything else we do will happen on the CSS side. If you don't want to follow along, you don't need to. You can just see the solution. You can basically just click the link, change the view to editor view, and you'll see the code. The way I'll structure this is that I'll start off with the most important, most relevant functionality, the button, the pseudo selectors, or the pseudo classes, and then I'll save the styling of the background and the H1 here for the very end. So if you don't care about that stuff, you can skip it. If you just want to see the button, I'm going to start with that. So without further ado, let's do that. The button has a class of btn, so I'll work with that, .btn. And the first thing that we'll want to do is just remove some of the base styles. So this button's pretty ugly. If you notice, so if I click on it, I get that outline. This one does not have that. Let me get rid of that. It's very ugly to have that outline. It's the default in most browsers. So we'll say outline, none. Save again, and it's gone. All right, next I'm going to get rid of a border, none, and I'm going to change the cursor to pointer. So what that will do is as I hover over the button, I get that pointer looking thing. I don't know what you would call that, the cursor, I guess. Not a big deal, but just a small thing. Then we're now going to move on to display and position. So display, I'm going to set to block. And position, I'm going to set to relative. And that part's important, position, because the way that we actually achieve this effect, there's a box shadow underneath here at the base state. And if you pay attention to the bottom edge, it never changes. It's always the same as far as this edge here. But the box shadow shrinks as I hover. And along with that, the button itself, the lighter color, shifts downwards to make it look like we're depressing it a bit. What's actually happening is that the box shadow shrinks a bit, and then the button itself moves downwards a couple pixels. And then when I click, it switches over to the active state where the box shadow is gone, and the button moves down a couple more pixels to take up that same space down here. So one more time, box shadow shrinks a bit when I hover and then goes away completely. So we need position to be relative in order to move the button down a couple of pixels. So you'll see what I'm talking about in just a little bit once we get to those pseudo selectors. Okay, so the next thing that we'll do is start getting into some of the colors here. So we have the background color of the button, which I have a hexadecimal. I don't have this memorized. It's FCAD26. That gives us that orangey color. Perfect. Then we have font size, which I have 16 pixels. Then after that, we have the font weight, which I have 300 pixels. We don't actually have the font that I used, which I think is Railway. Lato. I don't have that set up just yet. We'll get to that at the end. All right, so we have that. Next up, we'll change the font color to be white. There we go. All right, sort of getting there. Next, we have two that aren't crucial, but I like text transform. What it will do is make everything uppercase, which is how this button works. And yes, we could just change the markup to be uppercase, but I like doing it this way too. Text transform uppercase. I added a little bit of spacing between the letters, just 2 pixels, spread them out a bit. And now we get on to sort of the box model stuff, the padding and margin. So padding is going to be 25 pixels, and 80 pixels. So this is just going to make the button bigger. So we're getting there. It's the right size. Now we need to work on the borders here, and we also are going to want to center the button. So a minor thing, but we'll do margin 0 auto. And there we go, button nice and center. Now we've got the box shadow and the border radius. So those are the two final touches on the base button. So the border radius is going to give us those curved edges, and the box shadow will give us the shadow below. So let's start with the border radius. Border radius, I think I had at 20 pixels. You can experiment with that. But that looks about right. And then the box shadow, if you haven't used box shadow, there's a lot of different ways you can use it as far as the syntax. I'm going to use it with two parameters we pass in first, which is the X offset and the Y offset. So I'll show you a couple of examples here, but I'm going to start with 0 and then 6 pixels and then a color. And the color is another hexadecimal, just a darker shade of this basically, EFA 424. And that gives us the box shadow there. So as I mentioned, this is X offset and Y offset. So if I gave this a bigger number, like 20 pixels for the X offset, notice that to the right, we have a much larger box shadow that's also offset 6 pixels down. So I could make that bigger, smaller. I could give it 0 for the Y offset. Now it's only on the right side, but we want it to go directly below. So we'll do 0x offset, 6 pixels, Y. And what we'll be doing is when I hover, we're going to reduce that down to 4 pixels. Or maybe it's 2. We'll play around with it. So we'll reduce it down, and then we'll reduce it further when we click to make it active. Okay, so let's go back to 6. And that's it for the base button state, aside from the font, which we'll get around to assigning in a little bit. Now that brings us to our two other states, hover as well as active. And hover is nice and simple. Actually, they're both very similar, but let's start with hover. It's my favorite one. .btn : hover. We could also select just button, but it's better to use that class in case we have multiple buttons on this page. We're going to start by changing the box shadow. So remember, the box shadow shrinks if you focus right. Let me make this bigger. In the darker area, as I hover, it shrinks down. So we'll start with that. Oh boy, made that too big. Okay, so we have box shadow. And to start, I'll just copy our previous box shadow, mainly because I don't want to type that hexadecimal again. And all we'll do is reduce this down to 4 pixels. So basically shrinking it. So I'll save. And it might be hard to see in the video, but as I hover, that box shadow changes just a tiny bit. But you'll also notice that it looks a little bit different, right? It looks like the bottom of the button is moving up because that box shadow is shrinking. It sort of makes the button look smaller. What we want it to look like is more like we're actually clicking on it. And to do that, we need the top of the button to also move down at the same time. And this is where the position relative comes in, because I can now say top 2 pixels. And what that will do is shift the button down, as you can see. So our box shadow is still reducing. See if I can zoom in more. There we go. The box shadow goes away, or it doesn't go away, but it shrinks. And the whole button looks like it's being clicked. All right, moving on to the next state, which is going to be active. So in that state, we want the button to look like it's fully depressed. The box shadow should be gone entirely, but we're not just removing the box shadow, because that would make it look like the button shrinks, like we saw in the previous example. We want to also shift the button down a couple more pixels. So we'll start with our .btn active. And we can start with box shadow. And to remove the box shadow, you could just use the exact same syntax and just change it to be 0, 0, which is effectively removing it, or at least not letting us see it. So let's see if you can tell. As I click, there is no box shadow at all. Here we go. Regular state, hover, active, box shadow's gone. So that's one way to do it. We can also say box shadow none, and save. Either one. Then the only other thing we need to do is move the top down, because it now looks like the bottom of the button is just jumping upwards a bit, which is not what we want. So to achieve that, we just do top, and I think what I had was 6 pixels for this one. But let's just triple check how that looks. It's really up to us to finesse it and figure out what works, but I think that looks good. There we go. Perfect. So the math checks out. We have a 6 pixel box shadow in the first state, and then we're redistributing it where we're moving the top down 2 pixels and shrinking the box shadow to 4. And then we're removing the box shadow in the final state and moving everything down to be 6 pixels offset. Perfect. So that's it for the button itself. So you can leave this video if you haven't already. If you want to see the rest of the styling, I'm going to do that very quickly. It's not that exciting, but if you just like to be a part of it and you'd like to kind of have the exact same end result as me, the first thing I'll do is go up top and I'm going to select the body and start with just setting the background color, making it this yellow. So it's just background dash color, and then we'll have our hexadecimal, which is FCD04B. So FCD04B. There we go. All right, looking closer. Now let's apply this font. So it's font family. Lato is the font that I included here. All right, we got that changed. Let's also set the color to be white. Okay, so our H1 is close. Now all we need to do is center it and change the font weight. So we'll select the H1, all H1s, and we'll change text align to be center. There we go. And our font weight is 300. There we go. This button does nothing. It looks okay enough. We've got our click states, or our hover, and then our active state matching what we had earlier. If you'd like to see this in more of a full screen, if you'd like to admire your handiwork, you can go to change view, look at it as a full page. Awesome. So if you'd like, play around with it, change the colors, change some of the dimensions, add another button, that is offset to the right or to the left instead of down, and make sure you change the box shadow appropriately, but you can make it look like, you have a 3-dimensional button from a different perspective. Cool. So that's it. See you in the next video.